In today's video, we are looking at the RTX 4060 up against the RTX 3060. Kind of interesting in that it's a generational, upgrade, but one's 8GB with more power versus 12GB with less power. How does that hold up in the latest games? Which one would you rather have? Is it worth upgrading? Although we can see here, probably not already off the bat. Also kind of interesting in that if you're gonna buy one new, they're actually still available for the 3060s around the same price. The 4060 costs around $290 at the cheapest and goes up from there. But you can still find 3060s available new. And while for some reason the 1650 is popping up, so ignore that. And then there's also some 8GB 3060s, which are not the same thing as the original 3060, which was a 12GB card. The 8GB version was released later, and so you know what, we're gonna just type in 12GB here to get those imposters out of here. But do be aware that's a thing. The 12GB 3060s brand new start around $280. Now, granted, there's a lot more 3060s available on the used market, considering they've been around longer. So in general, you could probably get your hands on a 3060 cheaper, but if you were buying new, they are both still available and around the same price. So anyway, kind of an interesting comparison to see how do they both hold up in the latest games at 1080p and 1440p. And we're not just gonna crank everything to max, we're gonna play around with the graphics settings to see what kind of compromises are needed on each GPU to reach good frame rates. So with that in mind, we were looking at Horizon Forbidden West up first. We're starting out at 1080p very high settings, and there's something really important to notice here. The RTX 3060 has a lower average frame rate, but a much better performance in the 1% lows, which are represented up here. I show the relative performance here. And where you'll really see this is stutters in the frame time graph. So if you look here, there are big stutters and spikes on this frame time graph for the 4060. Why is that happening? It's happening because this game wants to be using a little bit more than 8GB of VRAM, even at 1080p resolution when using the very high settings. The 4060 doesn't have it, so system memory usage increases a little bit, which means that the graphics card is having to pull memory from pull the VRAM, some information from system memory, whereas the 3060 is not having to wait for that. And that's causing stutters in the performance. So that's where we see that VRAM issue take place. So in other words, while the 4060 is coming out 14% ahead on average, it's actually providing a stuttery worse experience at 1080p very high settings, where both GPUs are actually clearly powerful enough to handle it. So I think that's pretty interesting. But you don't have to play the game at very high settings. If we reduce down to high settings, notice that even our graphics card with more than 8GB of VRAM isn't trying to use it, and therefore we're seeing the 4060 take a performance lead in both the averages and the 1% lows. So if you're playing the game at the high settings, the 4060 offers the better experience, but if you're playing at the very high settings, the 3060 offers the better experience. So just kind of interesting to see how VRAM comes into play even at 1080p resolution in some of the newest games. Now, if we drop down to medium settings, the game still looks quite good, and both GPUs are actually delivering pretty high performance here at 82 and 97 respectively on average, giving the 4060 an 18% lead on the averages and a 13% lead in the 1% lows at 80 versus 71. So both GPUs can certainly be tweaked to get you a nice experience in Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p, but what about 1440p resolution? Well, the very high settings are once again giving massive problems to the stuttery frame time graph over here and killing the 1% lows on the 4060. However, I'm less concerned about this because we're at 1440p very high settings, so even the 3060, which has enough VRAM, isn't really getting you a high frame rate at about 41 frames per second. So honestly, these are probably just not the settings that you would use on either graphics card. However, if you use DLSS quality, notice that the 3060 is able to keep the very high settings and hit 56 FPS average, and the 1% lows are fine without big stutters in the frame time graph. However, there's still large stutters in the frame time graph on the 4060, showing that the 3060 is actually good for 1440p very high DLSS quality for an almost 60 FPS experience without stutters, but the 4060 is not. Which is at least interesting. However, you could turn down to the high settings which still look very good, and the 4060 is now delivering the better performance. Even without DLSS, the 4060 is now averaging 51 FPS, and the 3060 is averaging 44, giving a 16% lead to the 4060 in both the averages and in the 1% lows, which are 44 versus 38 respectively. So again, if you're fine playing on the high settings, then the 8 gigabytes of VRAM doesn't pose an issue. And then you could use DLSS quality. Sorry, you can probably hear my kids stomping around upstairs. That's how we roll on this channel. I film when they're playing happily, which sometimes means they're rather noisy. Anyway, so here we're at 68 FPS versus 58 FPS, so they're both giving a good experience, but again, the 4060 is 17% better in the averages and 18% better in the 1% lows. High settings DLSS quality giving you a good experience on both GPUs, better on the 4060. Yeah, you could also try turning down to medium settings if you wanted to not use any upscaling, but be around or better than 60 FPS on both GPUs. At 1440p medium native resolution, we're seeing the 3060 hit 59 FPS, and the 4060 averaging 67 FPS, giving it a 14% advantage, and the 1% lows are a 13% advantage at 59 versus 52, and again, VRAM not playing into the issue at medium settings. You could also use DLSS quality off of the medium settings. The game still looks pretty good, and now you're getting a actually a pretty high refresh rate experience for a single-player game on both GPUs at 92 versus 79. So the 4060 taking a 16% lead and a 10% lead in the 1% lows at 77 versus 70. Frame time graphs are looking pretty smooth on both, so good experience here. So let's move on to another game. How about Ghost of Tsushima? At 1080p very high settings, I didn't see issues with VRAM in my test. However, some people have told me that in cutscenes, the game can be a little more VRAM intensive, and I was testing actual gameplay here. The 4060 taking a 17% lead at 69, nice, versus 59, and the 1% lows are a 16% lead at 59 versus 51. Now, interestingly though, what if we turn on frame generation? So I think this one's worth pausing to take a second to appreciate what is happening here. So one of the biggest selling points of the 4000 series products from NVIDIA was frame generation. DLSS 3 frame generation is not supported on previous generations. However, AMD eventually came out with FSR 3 frame generation. And FSR 3 frame generation is supported on older NVIDIA hardware and AMD hardware. So with that in mind, we could look at DLSS 3 frame generation versus FSR 3 frame generation. But notice something, frame generation uses more VRAM than not using frame generation, which means that while our 4060 was fine on its 8 gigabytes at 1080p very high, if you try to kick on frame generation to increase the motion fluidity, frame generation doesn't increase the responsiveness of the game because it's just holding back a frame that you would have already had access to interpolate 2 frames and insert an in-between image, which smooths out the motion fluidity, but again, doesn't increase the responsiveness of the game. But it also, again, to insert that extra information and to do this process takes more VRAM, and that's actually tanking the 4060's performance down to around 30 frames per second, whereas the 3060 using FSR 3 frame generation doesn't have that issue, and it's actually boosting the motion fluidity to 92 frames per second here. Also, this isn't quite an apples-to-apples comparison, though, either, because FSR 3 frame generation and DLSS 3 frame generation don't quite use the same process to do their frame interpolation. Where NVIDIA says they're using more of the optical flow dedicated acceleration on the GPU, whereas AMD is using more just general GPU compute available in an asynchronous compute capacity, as I understand it. However, we could run FSR 3 frame generation on both GPUs, and this is a bit interesting in that, do you notice that the 4060 isn't crashing as hard as it did on FSR 3 frame gen as it did on DLSS 3 frame gen, so it seems to be maybe using a bit less VRAM or not crashing as hard when it runs out of VRAM, but also notice it's not really getting much of a frame rate boost out of it, whereas the 3060 is. So the 3060 is still getting a better experience using frame generation than the 4060 does. Interesting. Alternatively, you could increase frame rates by just dropping down to high settings and not using frame generation, and increasing frame rate this way not only looks smoother, but also it makes the game more responsive, unlike frame generation. Here we're seeing the 4060 take 87 FPS versus 76 on the 3060, giving a 14% lead to the 4060 and 6% lead in the 1% lows at 71 versus 67. Let's look at 1440p resolution at very high settings. Again, I'm not seeing issues with VRAM, at least not showing up in performance. Sometimes it can show up in missing textures or something. But anyway, overall, neither GPU is performing really well here. It's totally playable, especially on a controller, but we're looking at 48 versus 43 FPS, so 12% lead for the 4060, 14% lead in the 1% lows. But I think most people would probably be chasing a higher frame rate. One way to get there is using DLSS quality upscaling, giving us 71 FPS on the 4060 and 60 on the 3060. That's an 18% advantage to the 4060. And the 1% lows are a 21% advantage at 64 versus 53. And the game still looks quite good with DLSS quality off of the very high baseline. So this game's pretty performant without having to reduce things too far. Also, you could use frame generation on top of the upscaling, and also you can use FSR3 frame generation on top of DLSS upscaling, which is what we're doing here for the 3060 in games that have been updated to FSR 3.1, which decoupled the upscaling from the frame generator, so you can use DLSS upscaling with FSR3 frame generation. But notice the 4060 is kind of crashing on the VRAM again and not getting a big performance boost. Interestingly, if we go to an apples-to-apples comparison where both of them are using FSR3 frame generation with DLSS quality upscaling, we actually see that the 4060 gets a nice performance boost, again indicating that FSR3 frame generation is not as VRAM heavy as DLSS 3 frame generation is, which is kind of interesting. So if you're on an 8GB GPU, you might try out FSR 3 frame generation instead of DLSS frame generation if you're running into VRAM issues. If we move to 1440p high settings, we are now getting 60 FPS on the 4060 without needing any upscaling or frame generation. And the 3060 hits 55, so they're not too far off. It's a 9% lead for the 4060. And it's also a 9% lead in the 1% lows at 51 versus 47. So pretty good experience there. You could also use DLSS quality off of the high baseline. And now we're getting into that higher refresh rate territory that I think a lot of people really like on PC. We're getting 89 FPS average on the 4060 versus 76 FPS average on the 3060, which is a 17% lead for the newer GPU, although the 1% lows are only a 7% lead at 75 versus 70. So you definitely get good experiences in a variety of setting combinations in Ghost of Tsushima, but how about the latest Unreal Engine 5 graphical showcase with Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga at 1080p high settings, and high is the highest settings this game has to offer. The 4060 takes a 16% lead at 43 FPS versus 37. That's pretty low FPS, but do keep in mind that this game can be enjoyed at pretty low frame rates if you want to, because honestly, it's a very, very slow-paced game, a lot of just walking. Anyway, if you do want to kick on DLSS quality off of the 1080p high settings, honestly, this game already has a very soft image, so upscaling at 1080p here is maybe not as bad as I would say it is in a lot of other games because of how soft the presentation already is. But anyway, you do get to 61 FPS on the 4060 here using the upscaling and 53 FPS on the 3060. So 15% advantage to the 4060 and a 16% lead in the 1% lows. If we, instead of upscaling, want to just keep native 1080p resolution, you can reduce the graphics to medium settings, and now the 4060 is hitting 60 FPS, giving it a 13% advantage over the 3060, which is hitting 53 frames per second, which in turn, if you're on a variable refresh rate display, is perfectly fine in this game. Like I said, very slow paced. Our 1% lows are 16% lead for the 4060 as well. Alternatively, you could go down to low settings, which, despite being called low, if you just look at the graphics on your screen right now, the low settings are still very visually impressive in this game. We're hitting 71 FPS and 63 FPS, respectively, on our 4060 and 3060. So that's a 13% advantage for the 4060 and a 16% lead in the 1% lows at 59 versus 51. But what if we wanted to play at 1440p resolution? Well, the high settings are probably going to be too much at a native 1440p. The 4060 can average 30 FPS, but its 1% lows do dip below 30, so you can't even quite lock to 30. And the 3060 hits 26 FPS. That's a 15% lead for the 4060, 24% lead in the 1% lows. However, again, you don't have to play at native resolution. So one option is to use DLSS quality. If you use DLSS quality off of the 1440p high baseline settings, the 4060 climbs to 47 FPS average, and the 3060 hits 41, giving you a 15% advantage for the 4060. And the 1% lows are 21% advantage at 41 versus 34. The game is playable in the 40 FPS range, I would say, on a variable refresh rate display, especially with a controller and just taking in the scenery. But if you want to keep at native resolution rather than using upscaling, you could drop to the medium settings. And here we're seeing the 4060 at 43 FPS and the 3060 at 37 FPS. That's a 16% advantage for the 4060. And the 1% lows are a 16% advantage as well, 37 versus 32. Again, you could play the game at these settings, but honestly, Unreal Engine 5 does respond extremely well to upscaling from a performance standpoint. A lot of those big features like Lumen and Nanite, I think are really designed around the idea that you would be upscaling. And with that in mind, 1440p medium DLSS quality does hit 65 FPS on the 4060, giving it a 12% lead over the 58 FPS on the 3060, and a 15% lead in the 1% lows at 54 versus 47. So honestly, for a lot of people chasing that 60 FPS-ish experience, these are probably the settings you would be looking for on both GPUs. Alternatively, if you're wanting to stick to native resolution, if you go all the way down to low settings, it gets you to 49 FPS on the 4060 and 44 FPS on the 3060. It's an 11% lead for the newer GPU. And again, it's perfectly playable at these settings. But you can see that if you're trying to play at native resolution, you're just not going to get a 60 FPS experience here. That's just how it's going to be. But if you use DLSS quality off of the low settings, then you can boost frame rates to 76 and 68 respectively on the averages for the 4060 and 3060, giving a 12% advantage to the newer GPU. The 1% lows are 63 and 54 respectively, giving a 17% edge to the 4060. And that's, again, low settings with upscaling. But the game still looks quite good at those settings if you do look at what we're seeing there. Another big graphical showcase, this one using, I believe it's the Snowdrop engine from Ubisoft, is Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which uses ray tracing at all times. There's no way to fully turn it off. And at 1080p ultra settings, we're hitting 41 and 35 FPS respectively, 17% lead to the 4060. But this game's more of a first-person shooter style combat game, so I think here we would want to be at a higher frame rate. If you go down to the high graphics settings, the 4060 hits 55 FPS average, giving it actually a 20% lead over the 3060, which is hitting a 46 FPS average. So much more playable here, still might not be as high as you would be looking for in a first-person shooter style game. However, this is also the most demanding section of the benchmark that I'm using here. So other areas of the game do run better than this. If you use high settings, but with DLSS quality, which I don't love to do at 1080p. It does look a bit soft here, but it does significantly boost frame rates. We're now hitting 81 and 69 nice, respectively, which is a 17% advantage for the 4060 in the averages and a 15% advantage in the 1% lows at 60 versus 52. So for a lot of people, if you're chasing those frame rates, that might be the way to go. Because even going down to medium settings doesn't quite get you as high of frame rates as we got from the high settings with DLSS quality. At medium settings, native 1080p, we're hitting 62 FPS on the 4060, giving it a 19% lead over the 3060 at 52 FPS. It does seem like the 4060 has some larger advantages in this game, which could be because this is a ray tracing title, and maybe there's, a bit more ray tracing optimization on the 40 series, just kind of some speculation there. If we move down to the low graphics settings, the 4060 can hit 68 FPS, and the 3060 doesn't quite average 60 FPS, hitting 57. It's a 19% advantage to the 4060 in the averages, and a 17% advantage in the 1% lows at 56 FPS versus 48 FPS. So what if we wanted to instead move to 1440p resolution? Well, as you might expect, based on what we saw at 1080p, the ultra settings are probably off the table. 1440p Ultra is 28 FPS on the 4060 and 23 FPS on the 3060, giving a 22% advantage to the newer card, but it is by no means a very good experience for playing the game. So I think we're definitely going to want to change things up a bit here. Now we have a number of options for what we could do, but I think the first thing we're going to do is just get a higher baseline to work with before we enable upscaling. So if we go down to the medium graphics settings, we're hitting 41 FPS on the RTX 4060 and 35 FPS on the 3060. That's a 17% lead for the 4060, but still not that great of an experience. It's a 20% lead in the 1% lows at 36 versus 30. But this did at least give us a higher baseline to work with, and then we could use DLSS. If you go down to DLSS balanced, which is pretty aggressive for 1440p, but it did get us past 60 FPS on our 3060. It hit 63 FPS average here, and the 4060 hit 76 FPS. So maybe back off to DLSS quality on the 4060 might be a better choice if you wanted to retain a little more detail. Anyway, it's a 21% advantage to the 4060, and both GPUs had a pretty good experience there. At 1440p low settings, we're at 46 FPS on the 4060 and 39 on the 3060. So really, this is just not a game that's going to perform super well at native 1440p resolution. This is definitely a game where DLSS is going to come in if you want to be chasing the kinds of frame rates that most people would want on a first-person shooter style combat. So 18% advantage to the 4060 there. Let's go ahead and move on to Alan Wake 2. This is another one of those big visual showcases. And I'm not even showing off the RT high settings here with path tracing, because even the high settings with no ray tracing is already not performing super well here. We're at 46 FPS and 41 respectively, 12% lead for the 4060. And, this is a very slow-paced game, kind of like Hellblade 2, where there's a lot of just kind of walking and looking around, so you might be okay with that. You could kick on DLSS quality on the high settings at 1080p. It'll be a little bit of a soft image, but this does get you past 60 FPS on the 4060, hitting 62, and pretty close on the 3060, hitting 55 FPS. It's a 13% advantage to the 4060. And again, on a variable refresh rate display, you're probably going to be fine on either of these. And again, it's a pretty slow-paced game. If we, instead of using upscaling at 1080p, which a lot of people want to avoid, you could use low settings rather than high settings. The game still looks quite good on the low settings, and now we're hitting 56 FPS on the 4060 and 51 on the 3060. 10% lead for the newer card. Notice that this is the lowest the game settings goes, so there is no way to actually stay above 60 FPS without using upscaling in this game. But again, it's a game where you might be okay being under 60 FPS. Alan Wake 2 at 1440p high settings. By the way, high is the highest graphics setting in this game, although individual settings could be turned higher than the preset does. We're not breaking 30 FPS on either GPU, and there's some indication that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is destroying our frame rate again. You can see all these spikes, and that's kind of holding back the 4060, especially in the 1% lows. However, neither GPU is really going to be strong enough for using those settings. If we use DLSS balanced off of the high settings, we're actually now getting a pretty good experience on both GPUs, although it's a little soft using balanced level upscaling at 1440p, but I wouldn't say most people would find it unusable, and we're now able to keep the high settings and get 53 FPS and 48 respectively, 10% lead for the 4060, and again, pretty slow-paced game, so we're not quite at 60, but I think a lot of people would be okay with that experience. At 1440p low settings, we're hitting 39 and 35 respectively, so 11% lead to the 4060. And again, the game still looks pretty good at low settings, but notice that there's just no way to get anywhere near 60 FPS at 1440p in this game without using upscaling. Because, as you can see here, even going all the way down to the lowest preset, we're under 40 FPS average. So you could use DLSS at the low settings. If you want to achieve 60 FPS or better, you're going to have to use balanced level upscaling at low settings. And now we're seeing the 4060 average over 60 at 65 FPS versus 59 on the 3060, 10% lead for the newer card. And again, I think the game looks surprisingly good for low settings. And DLSS balance, not great at 1440p, but also fairly usable. So anyway, let's move on to another game. We could do Resident Evil 4 at 1080p max settings, and while the averages are 9% higher on the 4060, notice the 1% lows are a disaster, and we have the massive frame time spikes again. So this is another example of a game where the maximum settings, the GPU is strong enough to use, but it just doesn't have enough VRAM, whereas the 3060's 12GB VRAM buffer is enough, and it's able to perform well. However, if you move down to the prioritized graphics settings, the GPUs even out. I think this game must just like memory bandwidth, because the 3060 does have increased memory bandwidth, and so that's my guess at why these GPUs are tied, whereas usually the 4060 outperforms the 3060 when we're not going past the 8GB VRAM buffer. Either way, you're getting over 100 FPS on both GPUs, so it's a pretty good experience. At 1440p max settings, I'm seeing, once again, the 4060 take a slight lead in the averages, but have absolutely stuttery disaster on the frame time graph, leading to massive lead in the 1% lows for the 3060. However, it's also not super high frame rates here, so it's possible that, maybe this is beyond what you would have been doing on the 4060 anyway, even if it had enough VRAM. Although, maybe not. But either way, if you go down to the prioritized graphics settings, the game still looks pretty good. Although, once again, I'm noticing my 3060 is outperforming my 4060. By the way, I do restart the game after applying the graphics settings, so I did double check that I set the correct settings and restarted the game. I'm seeing my 3060 outperforming my 4060 here. Maybe somehow I missed something, I don't know. But anyway, either way, that's what I'm seeing. Now, let's go ahead and move on to Starfield at 1080p Ultra. And here we're seeing a 20% advantage for the 4060 over the 3060, but it's only 48 FPS versus 40 FPS. So this is definitely a game where the ultra settings at 1080p are not going to be getting you a 60 FPS experience on either GPU, although we definitely don't seem to be running into any 8GB VRAM issues, as both GPUs are well under 8GB of usage. If we go down to medium settings, the 3060 is now basically 60 FPS, we're hitting 58, and the 4060's got a 24% advantage at 72, and the 1% lows are 57 versus 50. It's a 14% lead for the 4060 and the 1% lows, 24% lead in the averages, and both GPUs are getting a pretty good experience here. But again, we did have to go down to the medium settings to get there. Let's go ahead and take a look at 1440p resolution. The ultra settings are going to be a bit rough at 38 FPS on the 4060 and 31 on the 3060. It's a 23% lead for the newer graphics card. The 1% lows are a 14% advantage at 57 versus 50. So again, while you could run the game like this, and some areas of the game do perform a lot better than this new Atlantis area I'm testing in, I think most people are going to want to adjust the settings or use upscaling. Here I decided to try out dropping down to medium settings, and medium settings get the 4060 up to 54 FPS average, 23% lead over the 3060, which is only hitting 44. So here's an example where the 4060 might just play at these settings, whereas the 3060 would definitely probably want to do something to boost things a bit higher. Although honestly, both of them would probably be better off with higher refresh rate if you can get there. So this game, again, does support DLSS, so let's go ahead and kick it on. So medium settings with DLSS quality is enough to get our 3060 up to 60 FPS average, and the 4060 takes a 22% lead, reaching 73 frames per second. The 1% lows are a 14% advantage at 58 versus 51. So looks like medium settings with DLSS quality is pretty good experience here. By the way, this game does also feature both FSR3 and DLSS 3 frame generations, so you could also kick those on. But let's go ahead and move on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. I test out the basic settings in this game since most people playing competitive multiplayer games turn down graphic settings to reach higher competitive frame rates. Here we're seeing the 4060 take a 13% lead at 171 FPS versus 152 FPS on the 3060, so both GPUs can give you a pretty competitive experience here, where honestly, most of your deaths will probably be coming down to your fault rather than your hardware. But anyway, If we move up to 1440p at the basic settings, we're again getting a pretty good experience at 123 FPS on our 4060 versus 109 on the 3060. That's a 13% lead for the newer card, and an 18% lead in the 1% lows at 71 versus 60. And again, you could also use upscaling here, but since we were already at pretty high frame rates, I didn't bother testing that out. Let's go ahead and pop out for some final thoughts. All right, so in this video, we looked at the 3060 versus the 4060 in 2024. It was interesting to see that both GPUs were still very usable in all of the games tested, including some of the most graphically demanding new games at 1440p resolution. However, oftentimes that 1440p resolution should be kind of with quotes or asterisks, where it's basically you can get a good experience on a 1440p monitor, but you'll likely be relying pretty heavily on DLSS at this point for these cards in the latest games at 1440p. That being said, the latest games, even when you're going down to medium or even low graphic settings, often still look very good. And using DLSS quality at 1440p resolution, low settings DLSS quality at 1440p in a game like Hellblade 2 still honestly looks pretty visually impressive, and we're getting very decent frame rates for the experience here. So I'd say that both of these GPUs did pretty well. On average, the 4060 definitely seemed to be between 10 to 20% faster. So let's just call it about a 15% lead. The exact games and settings you use to determine your averages will slightly throw it off. But again, somewhere between 10 to 20% faster. So I'm just going to call it about 15% lead for the 4060. Does the VRAM ever come into play? 12 gigabytes versus 8 gigabytes. We absolutely saw it come into play. Interestingly, the biggest place we saw it having an impact was actually with frame generation. So we saw interesting stuff like DLSS 3 frame generation, even at 1080p resolution, when games are stuck at their highest texture settings, often push the 4060 beyond 8 gigabytes, making the frame generation kind of unusable. So one of the biggest new selling points for the 40 series requires additional VRAM, which the 4060 can often run out of, and then makes that frame generation less usable. Whereas, interestingly, the 3060, which doesn't support DLSS 3 frame generation, can run FSR 3 frame generation and has enough VRAM to do it. So that was kind of an interesting thing to note, and we did find games where even at 1080p resolution, the 8 gigabytes of VRAM was an issue at settings that the GPUs were otherwise strong enough to use. However, that wasn't super common. And even when we saw it, like we saw it in the 1% lows here in Horizon Forbidden West as well, we saw it in Resident Evil 4 at its maximum settings, even at 1080p resolution. So people saying that 8 gigabytes of VRAM isn't a problem at 1080p, well, there absolutely are multiple games tested where the GPUs are both powerful enough to use the maximum settings at 1080p, but 8 gigabytes of VRAM falls short, so that's absolutely something to consider. That being said, I would still personally prefer the 4060 over the 3060 because in general, it is stronger. And turning down the graphic settings for someone who is willing to do that and knowledgeable about which settings to tweak can generally still get you a very good experience. So for example, it's usually as simple as going to the high settings instead of the very high settings, and generally it's actually as simple as just probably tweaking just the texture settings or something along those lines. Anyway, the point is, I would still prefer a 4060 over a 3060, despite the annoying VRAM issue, but I would only barely prefer it. It's only about 15% faster, and it does have less VRAM, which does cause you those issues. That being said, it is a bit faster, and I'm somebody who generally wouldn't be playing at maximum settings anyway on this class of hardware, because it does look like to chase the higher refresh rate experiences, you're gonna be turning things down a bit anyway. Honestly, both cards seem to be able to give you a pretty decent experience, and one thing I'll definitely say is there's really no reason to upgrade to a 4060 from a 3060, because again, it's usually only 10 to 20% faster and does, like we said, run into VRAM-related issues. So not too exciting. Anyway, Hopefully we get something more exciting from the 50 series. Maybe we'll get a 5060 and that is, a decent performance bump and hopefully has more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Because as we can see here, that's already a problem. And if hopefully as we get into the next generation, NVIDIA takes note that 8 gigabytes of VRAM doesn't feel great in the latest games. So that's where I'm at with things. Again, slight preference for the 4060. Really annoying that we're having to deal with that. Hopefully we get something better with the 50 series. And definitely I wouldn't bother trying to upgrade because it's not much of an upgrade. A bit of a side grade, slight upgrade. Anyway, it is a lot more energy efficient. I will throw that in right at the end, as it's a lot more energy efficient. So at least you have that. I hope all of you have an excellent day.